All right. So yeah, we don't have any plans, me and Riker. We just like each other this much that I joined him on his stream a few weeks ago. Talked about ARPGs in general, and now he's here. And we don't have any plans. We're just gonna talk. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. How you doing?
I'm doing very fine. Finally, something happening with the league release.
Yeah,
Been playing
yeah.
random shit and just waiting for this. Speaking of
I saw
random
your interest in
shit,
Dota too, right?
sorry,
Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I saw you playing. What's the Torchlight 3?
Yes. Yeah.
Any opinions on it? Because I've heard a lot of things about this.
So I played it way back when it was Torchlight Frontiers. This was like what, 2 years ago or something. I played it again when they rebranded it to Torchlight 3, and there was a big improvement. So I put out a big video on back when it was Frontiers. It was sort of this ARPG MMO thing. And there were a number of things that I didn't like about the MMO aspect of things, but there were things that I did like as well.
Hmm.
And if you played Torchlight 2, I mean, the first thing that gets people is the visuals. It's either you like them or you don't. If you're a
Yeah.
Torchlight fan, you're gonna like the visuals. If you're not, you're like, what is this, a mobile game kind of thing? But Torchlight has looked like this for 10, 15 years whenever it first came out. But anyway, so Torchlight 3 now released into early access on the weekend, and I was excited to play. I didn't have a chance until yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. And I go to buy it on Steam, and I see just like mostly negative reviews. I'm like, what happened? What happened? It turns out a lot of it is because they had server issues on launch day for an early access game. Like,
Hmm.
relax, guys. But other than that, I mean, I put in like maybe 5 hours. Um, a lot of it is rehashing what I've already played through. So to me, it's more polish, more refinement, more systems added to things that I've already experienced. And so far, I'm having fun with it. I can't say whether it's gonna have 1,000 hours of life in it or not. They haven't even added endgame yet, but that's deliberate. They're slow rolling out the content. So in some period of time, they're going to add an extra act, and then they're going to add the end game stuff, which is all supposed to be a super big surprise. So I'm looking forward to that. So far, it's fun, but like it's not something I can say yes, it's worth buying, or no, it's not worth buying, because there's just not enough of the game there yet.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it's early access. Everyone's just selling access to test their product out. That's kind of the name of the game
That's fair.
nowadays.
That's fair. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
heard a lot of people complain about the approach of it with and a lot of people refunding it, even bigger names
Mm,
refunding it and whatnot as well. But it's like I don't know. I like the idea of Torchlight. I try to get my little sister in on playing
oh, nice.
ARPGs. She and I played Diablo 1 on PlayStation back in the good old days. But no, she never got into Diablo 2. But Torchlight, she was visiting here like a year ago or something. We played one of the Torchlights, Torchlight 2 or something. But the
Nice.
graphics, I don't know. I modded it and it was better, but I don't know. I'm having a little bit of issues with it because to me it reminds me a bit too much about the kind of the color theme on it feels a lot like League of Legends, and since I'm a hard
Yeah.
grown up Dota fan, it's very hard for me.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. I mean, a lot of us like we grew up with Diablo and all these dark tone games. Path of Exile continues that D2 tradition of the dark, gritty themes, and yeah, a lot of ARPG fans. I feel like for whatever reason, ARPG the genre has sort of been associated with darker, grittier tones, and a lot of us just can't get over the brighter stuff. It's ironic because Torchlight was made by some of the people who made some of the original devs of Diablo,
Mm.
and I think they just wanted to make it look different enough and not be like, oh yeah, we're just remaking Diablo and calling it something else. But yeah, I mean, I vastly prefer the darker tones, but
So
if you can get past it, Minecraft Dungeons. Have you had a look at that?
I've
Did
looked
your
at it.
sister?
Like I've looked at it, but I've always been very anti Minecraft in general. I remember playing a MMORPG version of Minecraft. It was called Trove, I think. I was running a podcast with Project PT on Lifting Nerdball back then, and we tried out Trove, and it was fun for what it was, but it felt like No, it felt like I just came out of the womb and started playing video games, and this is the go-to choice. So when Minecraft Dungeons came out, I was a little bit hesitant, and I had other projects going, so I was like, yeah, let's hold back on it. And I saw the people playing it, and I felt like, this is not something I'll enjoy at all, mainly because of graphics.
I mean, it's the graphics, and it's overall a little bit like baby's first ARPG. I mean,
Yeah.
not literally, but yeah, it's kind of an introductory thing, casual play, and yeah.
I
I
mean,
gave the analogy that depth-wise, if Path of Exile is an ocean and Diablo 3 is a swimming pool, then Minecraft Dungeons is a bathtub. Just right now, the depth, for a game to make D3 look deep, there's that's saying something. But
yeah, that's
yeah,
true.
I mean, I had fun with it. I'm not going to say I didn't have fun with it, but like, I can't play that game for 1,000 hours, not with the amount of content in there right now.
I mean, like, I know we talked about this in the past as well, and even back in New Zealand as well. It's like the idea to make a game feel enjoyable for thousands of hours. I've reached 24, 25k hours or whatever it was in PoE, and it's like the whole idea. Same, you have that in World of Warcraft with expansions and whatnot, where a lot of things are changing, right? But that's MMOs games in that sense. But if you look at ARPGs that are by definition the definition of insanity, you're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. You're still in a situation where the whole idea for the game developer is to kind of hide the fact that it is an ARPG, to kind of disguise it so that you don't feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again, that it's actually progression, and the next time you kill 500 monsters in a map, it's actually a completely different experience. And I think PoE has done a very good job in that. But you
Yeah,
play a lot of
absolutely.
Diablo, right? Since I left Diablo before the expansion, because I got introduced to PoE. But you play a lot. You still play it, right? And what's your take on that concept in Diablo? Because I haven't really felt that there is anything in Diablo that truly disguises the fact that it's an ARPG.
Hmm. So it's a really cool take. I haven't heard quite that way of putting it, of like disguising the fact that it's an RPG. It's a really cool point. So D3 has gone deeper or more. It's given you more endgame stuff to do since you last played, but it's the experience from map to map in Diablo 3. They're called rifts. It's a lot more. There's a lot less variance. I mean, the monsters change, the layout changes, the spawn places of different let's call them shrines will change, but there's not like you can get in PoE all these different things that can spawn in the map based on different league mechanics. So that entire enormous thing is missing from it. So yeah, it feels more repetitive for sure than PoE does.
Mm. Because I always felt like that's kind of crucial for the RPG genre. We talked a lot about when I was in your stream about this whole idea of things to do in the game, and like
Mhm.
that can also be a little bit overkill. Like for PoE example, I feel that we have too much to do. There's too many options that a lot of people are feeling discouraged to experience a lot of it, and you kind of have to choose. I want to do this and that, and then once I've done that, then I can start looking into the other things to kind of miss out a lot of it instead of doing a little bit of everything. But I feel like
Mm.
due to the fact that there is so much, it allows you to enjoy the game for a longer period. But then again, I mean, it's RPG games. You have to create some variety for it, even if you're playing Diablo or if you're playing Minecraft Dungeons, Torchlight, or PoE. The variety is kind of crucial. That's why the player retention in PoE, which we can see quite clearly on the 3 month cycle that they're running with, that you have a lot of people coming in on a league release, and then after 2 to 4 weeks, you see a huge drop of players, and then that spiral continues depending on how deep the league mechanic itself is. The deeper it is, the better longevity it has. Whereas leagues with really bad depth, like Legion or Delirium for that matter, has seen huge amounts of player retention drops from the first to second and second to third month. But speaking of leaks and whatnot, we have Harvest coming up. Have you seen the development manifesto?
The one that just released, what was it, like yesterday or today?
Yeah, depending on where you're from.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, right, that's true. Good point. Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
was just going through that earlier. Yeah.
so what's your take on the manifesto itself? Since we have patch notes later coming in like 8 hours, 9, 10
Mhm.
hours, something like that. What's your take on the manifesto?
Yeah, so I always love that they put out these manifestos because it's one thing to have the patch notes, but then the manifesto, I find, at least for me personally, who's not like super into all the numbers, at least so to clarify, in PoE, like I'm not an expert on all the numbers and the mechanics and all this, but I really love getting insight into what the devs are thinking and why they're making the choices they're making from a game development standpoint. I absolutely love reading through these. So I could read these. I don't understand how it's going to affect like the meta or whether it's a good or bad balance change. But there are points that they make that I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, like I am all in favor. For instance, the two-handed buffs that they're doing. In principle, I like the idea of different weapon types affording different play styles and being viable in different ways. Like to me, if every weapon is basically just a piece of art and they're all interchangeable with no variety between them other than what they look like why do we have all these different weapon types? So I like the idea of having mechanics tied to the different weapon types, and if you're picking one type of weapon, you're going to have these pros and these cons, versus if you swap to like, they nerf dual wielding now. I think I saw some people saying rip dual wield. Again, I don't know the ramifications, but I'm interested to to hear your take on the actual balance ramifications of these.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you with the idea of like the identity of the different weapon types is should be there. I mean, usually in the past, it's basically been, if you use a scepter, you can't use whirling blades because you require a dagger for that, or you can't use leap slam because you need to use an axe or a sword for that, for example, in that kind of approach. But there's very little identification or identity behind those things. But I feel like when it comes to the the actual result of what was written, my biggest problem with ARPGs, I know this is something we talked quite a lot about, and that's the how ARPG starts off when they introduced to the community or the gaming community, and when they released as a very slow-paced ARPG game. You get to experience things. Things are tough. The enemies require several hits before they're dead, and you get to experience the difficulty of a slower-paced game. And as the game's getting older and older, it also follows the trend of going faster and faster. Which I think we both mentioned it would be nice to see them resetting in PoE 2. But
Definitely.
like with that in mind, now they're promoting a two-handed weapon approach where the idea is to attack slowly with bigger damage hits. But the current state of the game is to go as fast as you can, and you don't really need very much damage to clear the normal packs and the normal enemies. And the only time you really need to ramp up your damage is when you get to a very hard encounter, maybe a league-specific mechanic or a boss or an endgame boss, for example, or a map boss even, where you actually want that extra damage. Then I feel that the two-handed weapon, with the way they seem to be going with this, seems to be a decent choice. But you're still, the majority of your playing time would be clearing maps, which is heavily emphasizing on clear speed. And having a
Right.
slower attack to that, I'm not so sure. What kind of builds have you, or are you usually playing? Now, I know we already know that you're playing, my Lich Queen build. We know that. But outside of that build, have you been focusing on like spellcaster builds, or have you done melee builds yourself?
I did so I found overall in PoE, I prefer, well, in general, in ARPGs or most games, I like ranged characters. Not that I never like melee, but in general, I'm gonna prefer ranged. In PoE, I really like summoner builds. A big reason being that I didn't feel other ARPGs were quite fulfilling that fantasy in the
Mm.
way that PoE was allowing myself to get that feeling of my army. So I played Lich Queen for a few seasons, but the last season, Iggy showed me, which another one of your builds, what was my understanding, animate the flying
The
swords,
enemy weapon,
animate
yeah.
weapon, yeah, I love that. That, like, I never got that experience before of having an army of swords. I thought that was super cool.
Yeah.
Um, I had tried at some point, I think, like a melee duelist, and I wasn't crazy about it. Another time I did those guys that summon the totems. I I don't know the. So it's a build where I was a beefy guy who would, I think, be like jumping around or running around, but I'd be summoning these like totem type things, and they'd be doing the
Oh
damage.
yeah, like
I don't know what they're
Ancestor
called.
War Chief, Ancestor Protector, like the
Ancestral War,
melee
that's the one.
attacking
Yes,
totems, basically.
exactly.
Yeah.
Bingo. Yeah, I was kind of okay with that because I'm like, okay, well, it's different. But at the time, I think that was like the meta thing, and I was like, I don't know. And then I once I got to like your Lich Queen, I basically never looked back, and I've been summoner since then. But so one of the things that I like about the summoner playstyle in PoE versus say a D3's Necro is it allows you to be a sort of a passive or a more passive summoner, whereas in Diablo 3, the Necromancer, when they introduced him, they wanted it to be a very active summoning playstyle in the sense that you can't just have your pets be an army and do things. You have to be actively steering them and resummoning them like every second or so, which was in great contrast to D3's other summoner class, and that's why they wanted to make them different. But I see some of what they're talking about for brands in the dev manifesto about how they're saying that brands led to very passive play styles and they want to shake that up. And so that got me a little kind of poked at the back of my mind. I'm like, okay, well, if they're trying to tackle sort of passive play style stuff, are they eventually going to go after summoner type things? I don't know, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that the conception of passive playstyle and summoners is very divided in the community because summoners have been the most active playstyle in the entire game. Most builds they use a mobility skill and then they have their situational buffs like vault skills or whatever, like or cry or guard skill and whatnot. Which happens, whenever they feel like it's similar to how you pop a Vol Haste or you pop a Vol Molten Shell for the extra defense in those situations. So I don't really consider them being active; they're just situationally used. But the active playstyle of a normal, mostly meta builds is usually you have one main attack ability, maybe a spell or an attack, Cyclone, Archmage, for example. You used the Brand Recall. Back then was the only ability you really used. And then you have your mobility skill. So it's basically two buttons you're clicking. Whereas necromancers, depending on which type of necromancer you have, for example, enemy weapon doesn't last forever, so you have to resummon them. That's a process in today's state. You have to get the blades out and summon them on the blades. You have to then also apply whatever EE approach if you're going with that, or curses. So that's another button you click. You have your mobility like everything else. And then you have creating corpses and then an offering, which have been able to be bypassed by having the trigger weapons. Basically, you put your corpse generation and your offerings in a weapon that will trigger when you use another ability. So you get rid of that to make it more passive. But even with that, you still have those aspects of active playstyle. It's not holding down right click till the screen's dead, move to the next pack and do the same thing. So it's more active in that sense, and you don't have the defensive mechanisms of or mechanics in most summoner builds where you have leech and stuff like that, because your minions are not leeching to you unless you play the strength stack and zombie build. So you have to actually manually dodge things, whereas many other builds, they go in and they tank most things because they're going to out-leech the damage that they receive. So in that sense, it's more active, whereas there are obviously a lot of other summoner builds that are very passive. But they have a lot of activity in other senses, and they're provided with this passive approach when you get to the point of having like a trigger craft and whatnot. And even then, I don't personally agree that summoners are very passive. They are, from the builds I played, among the most active builds I've ever played, because of the fact that you're using a variety of different tools to create your army and maintain your army and make sure the damage is on point. Whereas other builds, you have maybe one utility thing, a mobility skill, and a right-click attack that you're just holding down. But you have other passive skills. I mean, I think the most passive summoner build I've played has been the Herald of Purity build. That's usually using Cyclone. I go in and I spin around the boss, and then the boss will die because the hits themselves is generating the minions for me. And then I'll have some sort of curse approach if I don't have that on curse and hit, and the trigger weapon, like I mentioned. So that's a very passive summoner build. But yeah, it's kind of different depending on how you do it. Like summoners in general is such a vast amount of quantity when it comes to different type of builds you can play.
So in short, we probably don't have to worry about GG making any changes in that regard, right?
I don't think so. Then again, we have a situation where summoners have always been very, very strong for many years, uncontested, if you will. Well, the only thing that I would say, we talked about this before you came in as well, it's the ED Contagion, the Chaos Dot builds with the Essence Drain. Since that was released at the end of 2015, that's 4.5 years. It has only received a significant change a couple of years back, not a year back, not even that. During 2019, they received a significant buff, but that ability has actually never, ever seen a single nerf since it was released, and it has been considered among the most solid beginner-friendly League starter builds ever since it was released back in 2015-16, which is pretty crazy. But that's also an ability that people sometimes say is clunky, because the concept of ED Contagion is like you put Contagion up and then you shoot your Essence Drain, then that one dies, then it's clearing. So that's 2 abilities plus your mobility. So already being a more active playstyle inherently than most other builds. I'm not sure if they're going to go after the more passive approaches of some of the builds. It's going to be hard, because they have to, in that case, like target specific approaches of some of the builds. Not really sure.
Affecting the others, yeah.
No.
I was seeing the note on the stun changes. So currently, how does stun work in PoE versus bosses specifically? Like, can you? I'm guessing you can't perma-stun a boss.
Oh, you can. You can definitely do that. It requires a bit of investment, but you can definitely do it. Basically, it's a threshold of the amount of damage you need to apply based off the enemy's HP to create a stun. And duration is based at that threshold as well, which you can then alter with other effects. And the changes they're doing is to avoid having someone having like mini stuns consistently. They're granting this immunity, right? And bigger hits you can then scale the threshold of this to create one big stun. But then an endgame boss would be immune for 4 seconds, and map boss, for example, will be immune for 2 seconds, for example. They did promote this as a good defensive mechanic for 2-handed weapons, which I really don't agree with, because that means you have to kill the boss before the stun's over, pretty much. Otherwise, you've lost that defensive mechanism. Whereas a fast build has proven to be very good in terms of damage outputs. I'm not sure if 200 weapons will actually be good in the upcoming league. Like last league, we tried to have like a melee league where they did buff up melee stuffs and whatnot, and the result was that nobody played melee. So
and now they remove the buff to dual wielding to reduce the chances of dual wielding melee.
Pretty much.
Interesting.
But are you going to try out any of the 200 stuffs?
So, given my preference towards summoner and ranged, I'm unlikely to, but I'm open to being convinced. Although I guess right now you don't sound like you're very enthused about the two-handers. I mean, I guess that my greater question then would be, knowing what you do about my preferences, what build do you think I would have fun with in the next league? Should I stick with so like last league again, I was playing the anime weapons build, which I was really liking. Should I stick with that? Are you anticipating any nerfs to kind of existing builds? Or do you think I should like here's this really new build that's going to be like really fun that I should try out? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, since we are, for those of you watching, I'm going to clip this up and put it on YouTube. So for those of you watching this after the patches, it should be important to note that this is before patch notes. Based off the manifesto, they did mention that Ball Lightning is going to be getting buffed for some very odd reasons. I have no idea why. So I would argue for Ball Lightning Miners to most likely be an absolute powerhouse of a beast build. So I'm not sure, but I think that will be one of the safest bets. I also think that Spectre-oriented summoner builds, as well as ED Contagion or Chaos Dots, is going to be very, very solid league starter builds, no matter what they do to them in the patch notes. But we'll see, obviously. It's hard to tell before. But I think those would be solid options to look into that I think you'd have fun with, because you and I have very similar preferences when it comes to builds to play in ARPGs. I'm not a big fan of bow builds in general, but melees at all. Like melee builds now will basically be oriented around focusing on AoE as much as possible. You want to kill the entire screen, and how much melee is it in exploding the entire screen? I don't know. The identity is already long gone, in my opinion, there. But yeah, those would be the builds I could recommend, I think, in the current state at least. Have you tried a Ball Lightning Miner?
I've never tried that, no.
It's
the closest, I mean, it's probably not close at all, but the only thing related to lightning, I played an Arc Witch for 1 or 2 leagues that I did enjoy, and then it got nerfed, and then that's when I found Lich Queen. Yeah.
Fair enough. Did you remember which build guide you followed?
Enki's.
I love promoting that guy. He's actually been doing a lot of testing recently. So I already know for certain, and before knowing the patch notes, that in the next video I'll make with a top 5 league starter suggestions, his bill's going to be in there, 100%.
Awesome.
But no,
Have
it's
you ever had?
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There you go.
I was going to ask: has there ever been, or what's been the biggest like shock you've had from Dev Manifesto to patch notes? Like, were you ever kind of? I know you probably don't put too much effort into the theory craft before the notes, but did the patch notes ever come out and just completely like, whoa, why are they doing this? Or this changes everything kind of thing?
Oh yeah, there's been a couple of times throughout the years where there have been like buffing random stuffs that should not have been touched. Quite the opposite, like ball lightning, for example. If the developer manifesto is proof for them not nerfing ball lightning whatsoever, ball lightning miners is going to be one of the most played builds in the entire community, at least for the first week. I can wholeheartedly believe that I'm saying that, telling the truth when I say that. If they're buffing it, which is absolutely insane. So that's one thing, for example. I mean, the nerfs to summoners that they tried was hilarious. The manifesto scared everyone, and everyone was like, "Oh no, they're gonna nerf this or that. They're gonna do this. Oh shit, no one's gonna play summoner." And then the patch notes hit, and it was like they barely did anything to it, and people misread things because of how complex the mechanics of how things work in PoE. It can be hard to understand. Like a great example would be the feeding frenzy buff, for example. Like feeding frenzy, you support a minion with it, and that minion is aggressive. So that's good for some minions, but that's mainly for zombie builds. And zombies was the main target of these nerfs. And then the buff provided had a 25% chance on hit from the supported minion to grant this buff, Feeding Frenzy buff, which is affecting all your minions with a lot of damage. And the thing is, they buffed this the proc rate of Feeding Frenzy to, I think it was up to 48 or 50% or something like that, which meant that for every other summoner build in the entire game that did not use zombies as their main source of damage, which was like 3 builds out of, I'd say, up to 100 other builds, actually got buffed because you only needed 1 minion to have Feeding Frenzy. Because in the past, sometimes it could take a few seconds before you got the buff, whereas with this change to it, you pretty much had that Feeding Frenzy buff immediately as soon as you entered a fight. So that was a straight up buff for all other summoner builds. And the usually Reddit's bitches about a lot of things, but they were just complaining and screaming about this. But yeah, that's probably the most recognizable step between a manifesto over to the patch notes, from my experience at least.
I think I remember that patch, the because as before you even said, I was like, was that the one that nerfed only zombies basically? Because I'd played a Baron build before,
Yeah.
and I think I was like planning to go with that, or before I found out that they were nerfing Summoner, and I'm guessing after that, like Baron zombie builds just weren't a thing anymore. But yeah, I
Yeah.
remember at some point I had played a Baron build
Yeah, it's funny,
before the
like
zombie nerf.
even after the nerf, people still did AFK blight builds with the strength stack zombie build. There was no difference to it. You could still do it. The only difference now is that it is cheaper now than it was before because less people played it, so all the items for the build was cheaper. So I mean, they barely touched it. But it's as soon as something's nerfed by a fraction of the damage that it did, everyone's just hauling ass and getting the fuck out of the build and playing something else because everyone thinks it's bad.
Yeah.
But speaking of bad, this has been a topic I wanted to talk to you about as well for quite some time. Since you are a person that follows build guides in PoE, which is absolutely great, it's fun. And you get the approach of the build, and you basically have the availability to do whatever you want, but you also have the availability to follow it to the T. And most build guides don't really promote crafting, which will be a lot of emphasis on, which will a lot of focus in the upcoming league release. Have you done any crafting specifically yourself in the past?
A little bit, yeah, and it's true that a lot of build guides don't touch upon that. Sometimes they'll be like just a quick note of like early level like craft such and such thing like when you're fighting Merveille, what is it like cold resistance rings or what have you. But they don't really go much deeper than little shout outs like that. But I think also historically when I would play, when I was like really playing a lot, I wouldn't start right at the start of a league, and then I would use like PoE trade I would just be trading a lot for anything that in general people would probably craft at the start of a league before it became available. But I think that the last league is probably when I did the most amount of crafting, kind of like starting to dive more into the whole PoE crafting mechanic. And yeah, Harvest is looking like it's adding what 200 or more, 300 recipes, something crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
Which I my understanding is it's going to be very accessible as well to new players, which is fantastic. But yeah, what are your thoughts on Harvest?
Um, I my opinion, Harvest, is that I hope that it has enough depth, which I don't think it will have. Um, it emphasizes, from what we've seen on Clear Speed, the way you go through the cycles of the harvest to grow your seeds has to be opening a seed cache in a map, which means that you want to go through the maps as soon as possible to speed up the process of your growth of plants before you can go into the plants and kill the monsters. So again, the Clear Speed meta will still be there, though not as much, since a lot of it is focused on crafting. I think in Trade Lakes, people will buy the seeds they want eventually instead of trying to farm them yourself. And then people just burst through some shit tier maps just to pop these plants basically, and then run it from there. I think that it's kind of a hit or miss approach because crafting is very complex. Most people don't reach endgame bosses. Most people don't reach red tier maps. Even fewer people reach it. Well, few people reaches yellow tier maps. Even fewer red. Even fewer reaches endgame bosses. Right. So with that in mind, it's also something that's been brought up in the past few years in the community is that a lot of people don't utilize the tools provided for crafting, such as even something as simple as essences that literally says on the essence what it does to your item. People use them as a pseudo alchemy or when they're leveling, and then they sell them or never use them. And we have fossils, we have influence orbs, we have awakener orbs. Like, it's just getting more and more things that we can do for crafting, which is something I personally enjoy a lot. And I think it has a lot to do with lack of information. So when it comes to Harvest League, I think that either people will feel more inclined to start learning how to craft and then dive into it, and then they're going to realize how super complex the crafting is. So I mean, it's everything from mods being restricted to level requirements to weapon restrictions to item restrictions of mods, influence restrictions, how you can block craft, and what actually will happen when you're utilizing these recipes from the harvest crafting options that you'll be provided. For example, a quick example could be that you're removing a defensive modifier to add a new defense modifier, or you're changing an elemental prefix modifier to another elemental prefix modifier of a higher tier, for example, and whatnot in those situations. And people don't really, a lot of people might not understand which mods on the item am I going to potentially remove and which mods can I get from doing that. And that's where the this whole knowledge part kicks in, where you have to understand which tools you can utilize to look this up. What is the restrictions? Can I roll this? Can I roll that? So that's what I'll be doing in the coming few hours, actually today. But in the coming weeks, we'll be focusing a lot on crafting to make sure that people have tools to go through. Since my YouTube channel got completely screwed over not too long ago, so all those crafting videos are gone. So I have to remake them. But I think that Harvest will have a hit or miss situation, because I think that most people that have not bothered crafting feels that it's too RNG, they don't know what they're doing, it's just wasting their currency, and they're not going to bother doing it. And I think a lot of those people might be interested in doing it now that will feel more inclined to learn it. But where are you on that spectrum of crafting? Like, how do you feel that you have a good understanding of which tools to look up, or where you can find the information needed for this crafting, so that you actually know what you're doing when you do it? Take, for example, if you're saying you're going to remove an elemental modifier from this one to add another elemental modifier, do you feel that you know which modifiers you're risking when you do it, and do you know approximately which mods you can get for doing so?
Absolutely not. So yeah, where I am, so because I've historically relied mostly on just trading, partly for reasons you just outlined. So and I also saw chat like bring up part of it is just hoarding of resources, because it's also that okay, I feel like I don't know, so it's a lack of knowledge of what the crafting system, but it's also a lack of game sense of understanding is it better to save this for higher level or use it now and like waste it? So I kind of default to, well, I guess I'll hold on to it because like I'm going to outlevel this item and whatever. So I don't want to waste the resource. And then it's also thinking, well, given the RNG, given the odds of getting what I want, am I better off using the resources or saving them and using them to trade for exactly the item that I want? And historically it just felt always easier once you're past a certain point into the league to just trade for things rather than figure out the crafting and whatever. But obviously when you're just starting a league, that's not as much of an option.
Yeah. No,
But I would love to see a resource, yeah, that clearly kind of a tutorial, crafting for dummies,
well, I'll get you covered on that later.
Awesome.
I think that when I'm talking about crafting a lot, because the way I craft personally, I have been doing it for a lot of years, is that I very, very rarely craft items that I'm going to use. And the reason I do that is if I play racing or Soul Self-Fan, then yeah, I craft things for myself, the generic stuff. But for more endgame items, it's very rare that I craft something that I'm going to use unless the crafting is very, very linear and the result is very high. There's a high probability of hitting what I will need for something that I will use. So yes, in those situations like craft, an example could be helmets with nearby enemies have minus 9% to this or that resistance. That's very easy to craft, like 2-socket resonators, and then I smack a dense or a pristine into it to get the ES or life mods that I want as well. So that's a very generic craft that I sometimes do myself for items that I'm going to use, and then I balance whatever rests or defensive or attribute requirements I would need on the other items by purchasing them. But for the most part, when you're doing like target crafting, it's sometimes very hard to hit something that you are actually going to need or want to use outside of very specific items, such as the helmet craft in that sense, where that is actually something you can do reliably. Another example would be minion ones, where you want plus level of all spell skills and or plus level of all minion skills. You can hit that with an average of 5 tries with a 4-socket resonator. So that's a very linear and very easy to hit, but can be expensive if you're unlucky, of course. But it's something you can craft, and it's very, the probability of you hitting it's something you're actually going to use is there. Whereas if we're looking at, for example, we can take shields that I've been crafting in the Delirium League, which was mainly targeting Herald builds. There was a certain mods that you wanted, but there's so many other mods that could be profitable. So what I did was that I set myself up to craft with specific tools or currency to craft a shield, where the goal was to get a certain mods to sell to the meta build. But the way I crafted it was to open up the possibility for me to hit other mods as well that would still be a profitable craft, even if it wasn't for the meta build. Which means that the craft itself is literally designed to be currency. And that's where we come into the point of investing currency. Because in trade leagues, you gather currency to purchase what you want or need. And you do that in different ways. Many people buy Exalted Orbs on the league release to then sell them a couple of days later to basically have them as an investment, as an interest rate, and then you get more currency for them later because you just saved your currency in that form, rather than sitting on Chaos Orbs, which will drop in value as more Chaos Orbs enters the market. And that same goes for crafting. You purchase crafting materials, which is basically investing your currency into a tool that you're then investing into an item that you invested in. And then the outcome of that is supposedly to be worth more than the investment you've been making. So it's usually just come down to investment when it comes to profit crafting. However, with Harvest League, it is so extremely specific with these different types of crafting. It's sort of like more advanced crafting being meta crafting that can cost you hundreds upon hundreds of Exalteds in crafting, which is very fun to do when you can afford it. But with the Harvest, you're in a situation where you can directly say, I want to get rid of this mod from the item, and I can do that, and it will turn into another one of these types, which I can use. And if it fails, I can probably do it again if we're talking about changing one elemental modifier to another element. So let's say you have a really good wand with fire damage, but you're actually doing lightning damage. You could change that lightning damage mod to a that fire that was modded into something else. And if that fails, you can just gather the resources you need from the harvest mechanic to do that again. So that's very specific, allowing people to actually craft items specifically for what they need, rather than the situation we have right now where target crafting is very, very hard to do and can be very pricey to do in the end as well.
That was the other part of it as well, was fearing ruining an item,
Yeah.
which I guess it sounds like Harvest is going to be much more forgiving with.
Yeah, since it's targeting crafting, right? So let's say you
Mhm.
have 3 perfect suffixes on an item. I'm not gonna bother explaining suffixes and prefixes, but it's basically it's like the 3 items. You know what suffixes and prefixes are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you and I can talk. So I mean, it's like when it comes to suffix, like you have those 3 suffixes, and you have 2 other good prefixes, and the third prefix is an elemental. Let's just bringing back that example. Let's say that's a fire modifier. You have the possibility to target this craft and say that fire modifier will be changed into another modifier that you might actually have use for. Then harvest mechanics of crafting is actually really good in that sense. Whereas if you didn't have the Harvest League mechanics to craft this, the only way you could play with this would probably be to use an anomaly door, which would be 1 out of 6 mods that you would actually hit it successfully. That's 5 out of 6 that you would potentially ruin the item. So that's where the target crafting for things that you want to use gets very tricky. That Harvest is fixing, if you will.
Interesting.
When it comes to crafting in general, there's a lot of different tools you can use. Anything from fossils to essences to chaos to metacrafting to blocking and whatnot. How much experience do you have in general when it comes to crafting? Like, have you done fossil crafting? Have you done normal alterations and whatnot? Have you done anything?
Oh yeah, so like normal alteration, all like the base currency. Yeah, I've done those things. I've not used fossils. I don't think I've used any league specific. If off the top of my head, I don't think I've used league specific crafting mats, but like all the basic currency ones, yeah, I've done those. To what effect, I don't know. But and I've also like if I get an item and I have room for another prefix or suffix, and I'm looking for certain stats, like I'll craft on my gear resistances that I'm missing, this and that, but nothing that I would call advanced or involve or really using big, meaningful resources, which again, I'm just paranoid to spend. So I never spend them and I never trade them. So I just hoard them forever. And then the league ends and I'm like, well, oh well. Guess I should have used this at some point.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of people are in that situation. Like we saw in the chat earlier, they're hoarding the items because they know it's good, but they don't know how to use it, or they don't feel like they want to spend the time to learn it because it is very, very tricky. And I saw in the chat here that you'd have to need a stash full of unfinished items if you want to maximize the craft you're getting from Kabuto. Sorry. So basically, that comes down to the point of understanding crafting. And to answer Kabuto's statement, you can still purchase the specific seeds you need to get life force, and you don't need unfinished items. You just bring the stuffs in before you do it. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. But like learning the information, let's take an example of an item that has a handful of good mods, but you have the possibility to do a craft that it will give the item a defensive modifier. And then you'll have to look at which type of different defensive modifier that specific item can roll. And if there's room for it, you can actually block it by bench crafting a defensive modifier that is a defensive modifier that has that tag basically that you do not want before you do the craft. That will rule that out of the possible mods that can roll on the item. And I think very few people does it, but I think a lot of people know about it, but they don't know or bothers looking this up, and that's very easy to do. And those tools needs to be there, and that's where crafting becomes very, very tricky. It's the same thing when we're slamming an item with an exalted orb. If I want life roll on something, and that's one of the highest possibilities to roll when it comes to the defensive modifiers or the life modifiers. But you also have an equal amount of chance to roll mana on most items. So a very popular way to block that would be to benchcraft a mana roll before you slam it. Because then you rule out the possibility of you hitting something you absolutely don't want before you use that exalted orb on the item to have a higher probability of hitting what you actually want. It all comes down to like probability and having the information and the tools you need to do the crafts. And I think that's where the league might see a large drop off in player retention, because I don't think most people bothers learning it. I know Path of Exile has a very steep learning curve and is much deeper in that sense compared to things like Minecraft, Diablo, or Torchlight. So it's like, but it also comes to a point where people don't actually always want to spend all those hours reading up on how to do it. Sometimes people just want to play the game, and that's why it's great to have games like Diablo.
Yeah, there definitely is the pros and cons to both approaches. I mean, one of the things that I love most about PoE is how complex it is, how many different things there are in it. I love the fact that I don't know everything about the game. I don't know anywhere close to everything about the game. So I feel like, in theory, if I was able to, starting tomorrow, devote 8 hours a day to play PoE for as long as it takes, I would every day still be learning stuff for a very, 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 very long time. On the other hand, it's also, because I'm not able to devote much time to play it, it's a little daunting. And I feel like oftentimes a league starts and I'm just choosing to ignore certain things. Sometimes it's the actual league mechanics, sometimes it's other past league mechanics dropping in there. I'm just like, okay, I'm not going to do Alva. I'm just going to ignore Alvas this time so that I can focus on learning, this other thing. And it's also wondering, okay, is it time efficient for me to be doing these extraneous activities, or should I be waiting for until I'm a higher level? I think there were some past leagues, for instance, where the league mechanic was kind of not time efficient at low level. I think they've done a good job improving that over time.
Mm.
And I think Harvest is supposed to be one of those that helps you throughout, not just late game.
Yeah, they did mention that it's going to be. I think I don't want to quote, but I do believe it was something in the lines of, if you're not doing it during your leveling process, you are missing out.
Mm.
They're definitely doing that.
One thing I'm wondering about Harvest, and I don't know if this is the right parallel to draw, but I draw, as soon as I found out that it's sort of like, oh, it's like, Farmville League or whatever, that I thought of Blight League in that, okay, some people just don't like the whole tower defense stuff
Mm.
and didn't like the mechanic just based on that. I'm wondering, I don't know how much this will play into Harvest, but right away I thought, okay, well, I think some people will fundamentally like this sort of thing, the way some people like tower defense. Some people will just not be interested in having to manage a little farm or orchard or whatever it is. Um, do you feel so? You spoke about how, from I guess a mechanic standpoint of the crafting, the sort of pros and cons of that. From a fun perspective, do you think that Harvest is something that is going to be something to engage with in a fun way? Just on like crafting aside, just the mechanics of finding the seeds, planting, harvesting, killing the monsters, rinse and repeat, that sort of thing. Is that something that appeals to you, or does it seem tedious?
I think it serves a very very good point. It fills a really good role in solo self found states. Because finding
Mm.
these seeds will then grant you the possibility and the tools you need for certain things, and you're able to then base your decisions with the tools provided that you find randomly. It's like a little bit of a rush that you get. Oh, you found this now. Oh, then I can do this and this with the items I found. Whereas in trade leagues, it kind of depends on how you play. Which brings me back to the other league mechanics as well that I'm going to mention. I think in trade leagues, I believe that from what we've seen, that I will personally most likely be just powering through, and whatever craft materials I'm not interested in using, I will sell them, and I will only purchase the seeds that I actually give a shit about. And then I will basically, my playing will be focusing so much on crafting that I will purchase seeds that I want, place them up the way I need it, which people will figure out within the first few days. And then I'm just going to power through maps to grow these seeds, and then I'm going to do that, and then rinse repeat that process. So I think that the league mechanic itself will ultimately, for me, I think, inevitably be tedious. But the enjoyment I have when I'm crafting items is very fun for me. So I think it will, counterweight that quite a lot. But like you mentioned with the league mechanics, everyone plays the game very differently because of how many things you can do in the game. I pretty much never delve, for example. I delve to the depth where I get specific crafting bench recipes, like 4 sockets and 4 links, because then you can do the trick of getting off colors with jewelers and with jewelers instead of trying to get 4 off colors on an item, which is cheaper in many cases. So I do it because of that, and that takes me about 5 minutes to go through and do that. So that's as much delving I do, because I'm not a big fan of it. I do the master missions early in the game because it is profitable, but if you want to do the league mechanics, there is always a way to do it the most profitably. This is the best way to do Alba. This is the best way to do this mechanic. And the only ones that are not really, that don't really have that, it would be like Bestiary, because you do Bestiary, you get some extra monsters and you get random beasts, and if you're lucky, you get something good. If not, whatever. So that's like the only league or master mission I bother doing consistently. Same thing with Sana, because of the off chance of getting the memories, distant memory mass, cortexes and stuff like that, guardian bosses and whatnot, which is provided through Sana. Other than that, I tend to, after a couple of weeks into the league, I kind of stop bothering the other master missions, sitting on a couple of hundreds of red map missions available for them, because I can't be arsed to. I just can't be arsed to. But if I did, I could be more, let's call it more of an efficient ARPG gamer, if you will. But I think it comes down to how people play. Like, if you really like doing the temple, then people will do Alva. As soon as you have an Alva mission, let's just do it. And you might want to look up the most efficient way to do it. You do this amount of red maps, and then you can just power through your white maps for it. Or you do another approach. And I think a lot of people do that based on what they enjoy in the game, which I guess is a good thing as well.
That got me to wondering. So I think it's awesome that there's these different ways to play and enjoy the game. There might be one super most optimal way, but how do you feel? What would be the discrepancy between someone playing as efficiently as possible and someone choosing to ignore certain things to focus more on what they enjoy? Like, is it like this person would be progressing twice as fast, or it'd be twice as powerful, or is it more like just a 25% increase? If you can ballpark some rough estimate on that.
That's a good question. It's hard to answer as well. If you take someone that does everything, that person gets to enjoy pretty much everything. Obviously, the person gets to enjoy all aspects of the game. But I mean, usually every league there is something that is better than everything else. So let's say, for example, that Sana is obviously going to be there for the off chance of the distant memories and whatnot. But let's say someone who is pushing Temple gets the availability for double corruption, gets the availability for corrupting their double corrupting their jewels for 21, 23 gems and whatnot, and they get the available league specific uniques from that content, as well as drops from it as well. And someone who chooses to target farm specific things because that person enjoys that much more. I mean, the enjoyment level would be the same. If someone enjoys doing everything, that person is having a good time doing everything, whereas the other person enjoying to do just that would have more equal amount of fun doing that because that's what he enjoys. But when it comes to efficiency, that kind of depends. There's always going to be something that is more profitable than ever. There was a time where the upgraded bridgestones was literally the best way to level to 100. So those were very, very, very profitable. So if someone wants to stack up on currency, if you want to do that, then that would be the focus. Burn through that, especially early on during the race sequence, especially even more in hardcore, where people are racing for that level 100 first. And being able to then generate a lot of currency by focusing on that, and that's their enjoyment, then that would obviously be what you would refer to as more efficient, if you will. But in the end, it's an ARPG game. If you're not looking to race to world first 100 or whatever your goal you have, I think it's important to have a goal, but make sure you have fun doing so. So efficiency comes down to what your end game goal is. Like, I enjoy crafting. I don't really care about getting to 100 first. I rarely level my characters to 100. And I enjoy doing that. So my goal is to have fun, make some new builds, and just have enough currency to make new builds consistently and basically throw it out on stupid crafts. And with that in mind, then I do what I would need to do to achieve that goal. And that's the enjoyment for me. But speaking of goals, what's your goals when you play a league? Is that something that changes from league to league, or do you have Do you have something that you really want to do every league you play the game?
Pretty much my goals at the start of a league or every league generally revolve around mapping. It's really trying to complete the atlas or see how if I can beat like my previous record in atlas completion. That I think has always been my. I mean, leveling as well, but that's it sort of goes hand in hand with the atlas completion because
Mm.
yeah. Well, it's possible. So I think I got a character either high 80s or low 90s, but probably high 80s was my highest level character. I think after that, it became more about Atlas completion, with leveling just kind of being a consequence of, well, the more maps you do and the higher you go. But I guess seeing the tremendous difference in power you can have between levels just depending on your build made me care a little bit less about levels. And it was kind of that way in Diablo 2 as well, right? Where a level 70 or 80, you can have all of the items together to have a completed build, and you can be more powerful in theory than a level 90 who has some garbage build with garbage items. But
Mhm.
I don't know why I really like PoE's mapping system and giving you some. It's I call it like Diablo's Greater Rifts, but with a purpose,
Yeah.
and it's just like it feels good to feel like you're every map you're doing is serving a purpose towards a greater goal. I think as RPG players, we like progression systems, and the whole mapping system is one giant progression system given to these randomized dungeons, which I think is really engaging.
No, I think so as well. I think setting up goals is very important, especially for games that are repetitive. Not only is PoE doing a very good job in hiding the fact that it's an ARPG, but having your own goals for it allows you to achieve something and you feel good about yourself when you reach that goal. And I think that's crucial for anyone playing ARPGs in general, which is my biggest concern when I played Diablo. Like it was eventually it was like, okay, you got infinite amount of paragon levels. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, what's the goal now? I want to reach 1 million of that. It's like, it's I don't like leveling, but I love ARPG games, which doesn't really go hand in hand because ARPG games are usually about you get a level. That's what you do. But in your case, like you said, when you reach high 80s, which is usually where most, at least build guides, are considered finished. After that, it's like, okay, you reach this point. The only thing you're doing now is get more jewels, which gives you either life
Mm.
or damage, or just life, depending on how you want to do it. It's just giving you a little bit more power, and that's it, because the level gives you one skill point, which is not that big for most builds. And with that in mind, the goal kind of shifts, and then you have the people that I want to level a character up to level 100. Never done that, so I want to do that. That's my goal. Or I want to try and create a wonky build, or I want to try a new build I've never done before. I want to play a bow build, God forbid. I mean, it's like it's those kind of mini things that you set up. Like, since as a content creator, I think that in many cases are easier for us as someone who plays mostly or mainly Path of Exile. Like, my goal is to get build guides out, and that means when I'm done with a build, I can just scrap it and go on to the next project. So I have mini goals all the way, and they kind of shift depending on what's happening. And then I have the crafting aspect. So I think it's important when it comes to games in general. Actually, I never asked you about that. Since Harvest is focusing on crafting, how is crafting in Diablo, if you don't mind?
It's very straightforward. It's I imagine all players understand it. I mean, I'm sure there's gonna be maybe some tiny fraction that's gonna be like, I don't really understand how it works, but it's pretty straightforward. All the information is there for you basically. So there's a couple different avenues of crafting. One is one NPC that you can re-roll on any given item. You can basically re-roll one stat. Once you've picked a stat to re-roll, then it's locked, and so you can re-roll it into another random stat. So that's how we perfect an item that we already have and like. Outside of that, there's the cube. In D2, we had the Herodric cube, right? So it's D3's version of that. They call it the Kanai's cube. That has a bit more crafting options in it, but it's really just turn a yellow into a unique, and take a unique and re-roll it with completely fresh stats to try to get a better version of it.
Hmm.
And you can just like add more main stat. Those are effectively the three main crafting recipes that people use. So it's very straightforward. There's, I mean, it's options that have been added progressively to the game to help make achieving the perfect item possible. But yeah, it's straightforward.
All right, fair enough. It's a bit different when it comes to PoE, tiny bit.
Yeah, a little different, a little different.
It's going to be very fun to see how crafting in the community will look. I think there's going to be a lot of people crafting some absolutely insane items, but I think that the portion of the community in PoE will that are crafting very high end game items are still very, very few, and I think we're going to be a little bit more of us doing it in Harvest because of how we can target craft so specifically with the league mechanic. I don't think we're going to see a huge influx of people doing that. However, when it comes to the mid-range items, if you will, not the mirror tier, several hundred exalted worth item, I think that will see a lot more items. And since the way you craft it is going to be a lot cheaper to hit these mods, I also think that that's going to create a situation where these mid-range endgame items will be cheaper because more people are crafting them, especially when it comes to meta builds. A lot of profit crafting is designed by following the trend of meta builds, and you craft for the meta builds before everyone else starts crafting for the meta builds, and you profit from that, and you move on to the next project when the market is flooded. So I think that we're going to see a lot of that happening, and with the way crafting is so easily accessible with Harvest, if enough people bother learning how crafting works, I think that with that in mind, we're going to see a lot more crafted items available in the community, and that's going to be very fun. But it also means that the people that don't like crafting will also have an easier, cheaper access to better items this league than they would have in previous league because of more people actually bothering to target craft. So it's going to be fun to see, at least.
You also hit upon something that just exemplifies the stark contrast between PoEs and D3's crafting systems, in that in PoE you have people that will literally like show off like, hey, look at this craft, right? Like look at this item I crafted. No one does that in D3 because it's just easy to put together. Like I feel like in D3 it's taken for granted that you're going to have an item with perfect stats. Whereas in PoE that's not necessarily, like it's more about working towards it. I mean, I don't know how common it is to have perfect items, but it feels like you're more likely to have imperfect modifiers. Whereas in D3, due to availability of resources and availability of or ease of use of crafting, it's really easy within a week pretty much to have a fully completed build with all perfect stats. I mean, maybe the number isn't, it's at 249 instead of 250, but like you have all the correct attributes on your items in a way that I personally feel it's too easy to gear up in D3. But I know a lot of players who feel like, well, if it was more difficult, then I probably wouldn't, play every league. I would give up, sooner or whatever. So it's interesting to see that there's people from all ranges that want the very easy road to completing a build, and others that want, to be able to the challenge of it taking longer. It's hard to make everyone happy. I don't know what the balance point is.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. Like from what I've heard, since I haven't played D3 since the first expansion came out, I've been told that you can pretty much play for 24 hours on a season release, and you can have full gear pretty much close to perfect within those 24 hours. In PoE, I saw a Reddit post earlier today with a new undisputed best two-handed axe, which would have been able to be crafted for quite some time now. And now somebody crafted an item that is better than anything else in existence right now. Which is it's cool because like the way we craft these insane items, during Delirium League I was crafting a lot of summoner helmets, and was a few others who did it at the same time as me, and I hit a really good helmet worth about 250, 300 exalted or something like that, which was extremely good. And then I looked up the odds of hitting the absolute perfect modifiers for such a helmet, and it would require, I think it was close to 2 million essences that would needed to be used to have I think it was a 70% probability of hitting it within those 2 million essences. So after using 2 million essences, there's a 70% chance that within those you would have hit those modifiers. But that's just straight up hitting it on one click. Obviously, there's other crafting mechanics like annulling off that one bad mod if you hit 5 good ones and then slamming the correct one. And those metacrafting processes would also be possible to do it with. But I mean, the odds of hitting these things are very hard. But Chris Wilson, like GGG, has gone out and said that they want crafted items to be the best things you can get. Unique items can provide you with different approaches to builds, like Chevron's Rapids as an example, or Ivory Tower allows you to go low life in different ways, where Energy Shield will be your main source of defense, which a rare item is unable to provide you with that mechanic. But rare items are in general supposed to be able to be crafted to the point where it is better than a rare item. Another example is the build I suggested you'd look up would be a Ball Lightning Miner. I do believe I have the guide on that, by the way. I'll have to check that out. That usually is using an item called the Tremor Rod, which is a unique stuff, which is absolutely crazy good. However, you can reach higher value by crafting Sambar Scepters for the build. It's going to require a lot of investment for it to be better than the unique, but you can, and that just shows that the way a rare item can be better than the unique items, but in many cases it has to be very, very well crafted, and that can be either requiring a lot of luck or a shitload of currency. So it kind of depends, and I think I like that approach where crafting gives you that sense of accomplishment, and at the same time it's for the sake of profit or for the sake of using it, rather than like D3 here, I got this unique item, let's just re-roll it a few times and okay, now I'm happy with it, I can get 2 more strength or whatever. But the I don't know, I feel like crafting is a big thing in PoE, but I don't think a lot of people are utilizing the tools provided because of how complex the mechanic is, which I'm hoping I'll be able to help the community with in the coming days.
Awesome. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, I hope it's going to be good enough. But yeah, I think that's Harvest League that we'll see. Taking Harvest League aside, has crafting been something you're interested in, or is it something you're like, yeah, because you're just hoarding the currency? Have you ever felt like encouraged to actually use those currency ores rather than hoarding them, since you've gone through a few leagues where you're just sitting there with a lot of currency that is just disappearing when you're done?
So I love the idea of crafting. Have I ever felt encouraged, not by the game itself, I've been encouraged by guides. I've been encouraged. All everything outside of the game encourages me to craft. I don't feel the game itself, like, it gives me these things, and then that's it. It's like, well, we know you're gonna screw it up. Here you go. So, but yeah, I feel all the encouragement comes from outside sources that help demystify and even like kind of say, hey, it's not that complicated to this is a good idea to do this craft or that craft. Yeah, because I love the idea, and I love the idea that the best items in the game are going to be through crafting. That you have to kind of earn them that way. Having the uniques is great and all, and I think it's a good thing to strive for. And if for more casual players, like, that's the end game, it's unique items. Like, I think that's cool, but I think for those who want to dive even deeper, having crafting be that extra level of depth to go even further without it like completely eclipsing the power of, well, I mean, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, completely eclipsing the power of those who just stick with uniques. I think it's really cool to have that extra edge via crafting. But it does feel, at least to me, superficially, that crafting to its maximum extent is more of a like pro player thing, and that more casual players just sort of like, maybe they'll dabble a little bit, they'll do like little easy things like I do, but demystifying the tangled web of various crafting things that you can do. I feel, at least right now, it's beyond the ken of the casual player.
Fair enough. But like, we have a situation with crafting in PoE is used through orbs, and orbs are also the main source of, well, it is your currency. Whereas in most generic RPGs, you have gold. And do you feel like gold becomes futile at some point in Diablo?
Oh, absolutely.
And in
100%.
PoE,
Yes.
we have like a baseline of currencies, like Exalted and Chaos, and then if you're lucky, you get a mirror. I've played 25k hours and never seen one drop, by the way. So they're super rare. But we have like Chaos Orbs and Exalted Orbs being like the main source of currency. That's like the standard line of this is the sort of main currency orbs you're using. Whereas, well, that's also because a lot of things that are like mods you put on the map device is charged in Chaos Orbs. Some people
Mhm.
kind of use those as the baseline currency. You buy things for mostly in Chaos Orbs, you buy things for mostly in Exalted Orbs. But there's so everything else that you get is inherently the translation of gold from other games. So any orb you find is, in general, that is your gold. But in PoE, that never really loses its touch because whatever gold-ish you find, it still has a use in different ways. Either you can translate it over and flip it over to Chaos Orbs, the baseline currency used in the game, so that you then can utilize for purchasing or crafting for that matter. Whereas in other games like Diablo, for example, then since we're reverting back to that a lot, you have gold, which is used for I don't even know what, because the crafting is like you have gold, and you get too much of it, you'll never need to use it, right?
Pretty much. Like they added a gold sink, but it's like gold is pretty much just used for that, and you can easily get the gold back. So it's almost a non-existent gold sink. I mean, yeah,
Is there a repair
is
system?
used. Pardon?
Is there?
There is a repair system. It used to be the gold sink. People didn't like that, so they just reduced repair costs to the point that, well, I don't know if it's that they reduced repair costs or just that we're playing at such high difficulties that the gold find is so high that you're never running out of gold due to repairing. What it is you can spend gold to improve a map, basically. Let's say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you improve every map, then you can afford to improve one out of every 3 maps based on how much gold you make back from the map.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's there, but like it's pretty much the only use for gold. So it's almost like it's not even a gold sink. You just say, okay, well, every 1 out of 3 maps I'm improving. And all maps are the same. It's not like in D3, all maps are the same. It's not like I want to save up for this very important map, you know. Uh, so it doesn't feel like a meaningful gold sink. That said, I'm not advocating for this change to be made in PoE, but if in theory my crafting materials were bound to myself, or I guess if I was playing solo self-found, I would be far more inclined to actually use them. Because right now I feel like, well, I can use these, or I could trade them, and presumably I'm going to be better off trading them than me figuring out how to use them properly. But yeah, I guess solo self-found is the answer to learning how to use the
Yeah.
crafting mats myself. Yeah.
I think solo self-found is definitely one of the best ways to play PoE. I don't personally like it because I want to power through a ton of different builds, which is easier to do with the trading available to me. But I think solo
Mhm.
self-found is absolutely something that pushes players to use every single orb they find in a good way for them to improve themselves. So, and I think that's really good because you have, like it's mentioned in the chat as well, because you're provided with the choice. You're not sitting there with something that you're not going to care about, because if you want to care about everything, then you play solo self and you're going to be forced to learn, or you're going to have a really hard time. And in Trade League, you have the choice to, I don't want to learn this, I have no interest in doing that, so I'm just going to flip it over to Chaos Orbs or Exaltus, and then I'm going to use that to purchase the items I want to play for this build, and then I can use whatever extra currency I have to create a new build if I want to try something else. And I think that's a kind of the beauty in it. But like, there isn't any direct sync of currency in PoE. Yes, you have to pay for the mods on an item. However, that is mostly used for 2 things: either for challenge completions of the league, or you use that currency to invest. Let's say you put Legion encounters on the map as an example, but the only reason you are investing that sink, if you will, is because you know that the probability of you earning that currency back from that map is already there. That's why you would do it, unless it's for a
Mhm.
challenge or if it's for fun. For some cases, in my case, I barely do it because my profit waste in PoE is rarely spamming maps because I get bored doing the same map over and over again. I've done racing in the past, and running 1,000 underground sea maps takes its toll. So I do crafting and whatnot, whereas the investment of my currency is there. Other games that have these currency sinks usually reverts into repair costs. Like World of Warcraft is another example of that, since we're on the Blizzard train, where
Mhm.
people have millions upon millions of gold, and the only real sink you have is eventually some consumables for people to do that. But generally, it's just the only real sink of money or currency is the repair cost, which Diablo is utilizing but nobody cares about it because it's not a problem. It's not something you have to think about. It's just a nuisance that sometimes you have to repair your gear. And we don't really have that in PoE in that sense. Everything you get is like, you can use the tool you've been provided, or you can sell the tool and use the new stuff you get for a variety of things. Which would you prefer when it comes to games? Like, do you prefer to have the sink of currency to exist to make people value the orbs in a different way, or do you prefer the well? It's hard to describe it without already showing how biased I am, but would you prefer to have an option to do whatever you want?
Yeah, that's tough. I know that before when Diablo 2 was the last ARPG I had played, I was not on board with trading. So I like to be able to just do everything myself. I like to, I really preferred to have that option and not deal with trading at all. I think the most trading I've done, honestly, is PoE. I've not traded as much in any other game. Well, I'm not going to count like Diablo 3 Auction House because it's not really trading. Um, but I think in general, giving players options is almost never a bad thing. The only time you can argue it's a bad thing is if like you have so many options that it's choice paralysis. But in general, I like to err on the side of arming players with choice. So yeah,
Hmm.
that's yeah.
Well, when it comes to this whole idea of ARPGs in general, with the Diablo versus PoE, there's always a lot of different options in it, and the providing with the option to utilize the tools you want. Like, you're in a situation where I feel like you're getting limited, right? When it comes to decision making in many games,
Mhm.
and that's trading is a huge aspect of decision making, which is completely ruled out in Soul Self Found. But you mentioned the auction house, and it seemed to me
Mhm.
like you didn't like that at all. To me, when I played Diablo 3, the auction house was a big influence in my enjoyment of the game, because it was another layer of game I could play. I could flip the market. I can play around with it even more with the real money auction house. But that turned out really well. But the point being that there's another another way of enjoying the game when you have an auction house available. In PoE, you don't really have an auction house in that sense, but you still have the availability to play the market, flipping items and whatnot. And the goal is just to get as rich as possible. But at least though in Diablo, that was like a money sink, and allowed you to value the currency you got, which, based from what you told me, seems to not really exist. And that's similar in
Mhm.
PoE, where the more currency you have, the more availability or easier access you have to these higher endgame super crafted items, which is so hard to craft that you either have to be very lucky or be super rich to be able to pull through. But what's your take on that sense with an actual auction house? Would that be a good thing for the sake of actually creating a value for the currency you have, or do you feel that Diablo is better in the current state with not having the auction house in that sense, and comparing that to Path of Exile?
So I believe that removing the auction house was one of the best things that happened to Diablo 3 because along with that, they retooled drop rates. They introduced something called smart loot, which makes it such that if an item drops, it's most likely to drop with it's going to be an item most likely for your class. It could still be for another class, but it's most likely for your class, and most likely with in D3 we have a main stat system. You're either a strength, a dex, or an intelligence character. As a
Mm.
strength character, you never want dex on gear. If it has dex, it's useless. If it has int, it's useless. Before smart loot, that meant that literally 2/3 of all loot that dropped was useless to you because it wasn't your main stat. And that's an entire other problem. But outside of that, the problem with the auction house was not inherently the auction house itself. I do believe there's probably a way to properly introduce an auction house. It's that the game's drop rates were balanced around the use of an auction house. So you can play the game for 50 hours and get one unique item, and it's going to be garbage. Because even when you do get a good item, it's not going to have the right stats on it. So the problem for me with the auction house, and I played the crap out of the auction house. I played auction house almost exclusively. Like my balance of playtime was like 90% auction house, 10% game, because I quickly realized it is vastly more efficient to flip items on the auction house
Mm,
than to grind for gear. Because whatever items I find are not going to be useful to me, and I could either so that means I'm finding items that I'm going to sell on the auction house, or I just constantly scan for undervalued items. I learn the market. I buy an item for 10,000 gold and I sell it for 1 billion gold, and
mm.
bam, you know. And then with that billion gold, I buy all the items that I need to the point that it felt bad playing the game, knowing that I could be making so much more efficient use of my time by just playing the auction house. So there's ways
Okay.
to fix that, but I feel that fundamentally you were too rewarded for playing the auction house, and I feel that the most efficient way to play the game should be playing the game. The auction house should be a choice, but what should be most rewarding is actually playing the game, not buying and selling on an auction house, in my opinion.
But that's the just to chime in. That's pretty similar in PoE. Like one of the most profitable ways is not always playing the game. You can play the game and make a lot of profit, if you will, if we're talking about pure profit stuffs. There's a lot of things you can do in PoE that is very, very effective. You can group farms, port maps to get cards that gives you pure exalted orbs, but flipping the auction house is still one of the best way to make currency, without a doubt. Just hands down, you buy them one by one because trading is terrible. We don't have an auction house, so people buy them from the trade websites to
Mhm.
buy the small quantity for a low amount, and then because people that crafts like myself, we then go to someone who has a huge amount of stock or a huge amount of quantity of these crafting mats, and we are paying 2, 3, sometimes even 4 times as much because we only have to do one trade with that person, and that person would then have triple their investment by flipping, or in a pseudo flipping, if you will, because they're buying to create a stock and then selling a stock instead as a quality of life approach.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's still one of the most effective profit ways to do in PoE. So it's not very different from Diablo in that sense, with even without an auction house, but there's still trading available.
I think the big differentiating factor, and I agree that it is similar. I think the big differentiating factor is that the auction house system was as literally efficient as trading can be, and the PoE trade system is deliberately cumbersome. And that's why the devs are so adamant to not making it easier, because if you make it easier, then all of a sudden it becomes vastly more accessible to all players to just gear up via trade or auction house. Whereas right now, while it is super profitable, not as many people do it as they did in D3 because it's more difficult to understand, it's more difficult to execute, it's more time consuming. So I think that's why they want to add these hurdles to jump through for PoE trading to not make the game just a trade game, and those who don't trade are just stuck in the kiddie pool while all the trade people are diving in the deep end.
Hmm.
I don't know how big that differentiation is. I don't know how many people really like dive deeply into that level of trading. But like to me personally, if I feel like I'm being 10 times or 100 times less efficient doing one thing than doing another thing, it really hurts my enjoyment of a game. Like it's one thing that if I don't have the technical skills or the ability to do something as well as another player, and so they're more efficient than me because they're better at the game than me, I'm okay with that. But if they're 10 times better at the game than me or 100 times better at the game than me because they're doing a different activity than I'm doing, that it like I like the ability to play the way I want to play, but I want there to be less of a gulf and difference between those activities that like, well, if I choose to not play optimally, I'm just so far behind. That definitely impacts my enjoyment of the game.
That makes sense, absolutely. I feel like in PoE, it's a bit harder to see who plays the most efficient. You don't see who has the most currency. You don't. The only thing you
Mm,
really see is like the who delves the deepest and who's the highest level, and then whatever showcase people do on Reddit and YouTube, basically. I think like that sense of, with a lack of better way to describe it, let's call it like a sense of competition, perhaps. Because I feel like I'm a gamer who spent a lot of time within esports and competitive games, mainly
mm,
Dota back then. And going into a game without that, that's why I enjoyed racing a lot, playing hardcore and whatnot, because that gave me that thrill and that approach. But I don't do that anymore. Now I'm focusing more on actually having fun with the game, and I don't have that competitive approach to it. It's more like, okay, I have a bunch of currency. I know people that do delving very effectively can make, mirrors a day, and that's very easy to do if you know what you're doing. It obviously takes knowledge and experience and a lot of effort, but it's not very hard to achieve that. Um, but I feel like the enjoyment in that sense gets very different from who you ask. Some people might want to, their goal, it's again going back to the idea of having a goal for what you do in a game. May it be Diablo, may it be Path of Exile. Like, I want to do this with the league. I want to get 36 challenges or 40 challenges this league. I want to get that and that. And I want to try this build out. And that's where the enjoyment kicks in rather than other approaches. But when it comes to actual hoarding value, you don't really have that competition in that sense, at least not in the leagues. I remember that being a thing in Standard League in Path of Exile. There was or is a couple of guys who have the most mirror service items, basically the best crafted items in the game. They have most of those, which is really cool, and that's one sense of enjoying, or one way of enjoying the game, I guess. It's gonna be fun. Speaking more about trying to steer it into more about Harvest, we don't really have much more than the patch notes coming up, and you've seen the development manifesto. Do you have any expectations from your experience in the game, and you saw the development manifesto? What's your expectations and what's your hopes to see in the upcoming patch notes?
Oof. Well, so first off, I expect to like Harvest. What do I expect to see from the patch notes or anything like that? I don't really know what to expect beyond that, to be honest. I'm looking through right now a little bit here, see if anything jostles the memory. But I see that they're making some changes to cluster jewels, or further like cementing them into the game. I love the cluster jewel system. I think it's one of the best innovations in the ARPG genre in probably 10 years or more. So love the idea, and I'd love to see something like that in every ARPG going forward. Like some ability where you have a skill tree and then you can somehow grow another branch. I think that's a genius system.
You don't like the Diablo
But
3 skill tree twig?
oh, wait, 3 or 4?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, so like the way it is now, the D4 skill tree is very simplistic, or the skill twig is very simplistic. But imagine you take what there is now, and you give them the ability to add. Players can add branches and build up into something more complex. Because I think what's important in order to try to capture as wide an audience as possible is make the game at the start easy to grasp for new and casual players, but then as you go deeper, you can create depth. So if it starts off with a skill twig, but then you can grow it into a full tree and maybe even a forest, I think that's a good way to capture the hardcore players as well without overwhelming the more casuals right off the bat.
Well, that makes sense. Because I remember when Path of Exile released the Ascendancy patch quite some time ago now, where they kind of killed a lot of build diversity. So, with a lack of variety in builds being able to be designed in certain genres, where some builds actually gained a better variety or diversity, I felt that in general it kind of destroyed a lot of variety in the game. They have, ever
Mm.
since that patch came in, have been providing us with new abilities, new tools, new updates that has been in the line and the goal to strive towards with increasing build diversity in the game where what people can do. And that hasn't stopped. It's been in the same rampant speed going through every league release where there are new things we can do consistently. We've seen everything from trigger uniques to spell slinger to the brands and the rune binder and all of these things and the different ways to approach totems. So it's just consistently adding more things that we can do. And we back 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, we got the chaos approach to the game, that archetype with the SS strain and whatnot. So they're consistently just adding more and more things. We've gotten received golems, and now we're getting a new type of brand, being Arcanist brand, which can be utilized with, linking it with another active ability, inherently triggering it with its frequency, the cast frequency. So you're in a situation where that feels like, oh, I'm going to use that with a spell ability like Arc, for example. But it also provides us with the possibility of utilizing it with things like as a utility tool. Like, as an example, we talked about this a lot, which I'll probably be doing as my League starter, depending on the patch notes, where I use Arcane's Brand to generate corpses. So it's basically a utility tool where I cast that out and that will generate corpses for me that I can either use another Arcane Brand to consume those corpses in the form of Volatile Dead or Detonate Dead. And as a Necromancer consuming corpses, you get extra attack and cast speed. So you can just completely skyrocket that kind of mechanic by, making them feed to themselves, feed itself within the mechanic of the abilities. And that's just another way of approaching something that they were introducing to the game, which a lot of people just saw, oh, we can put Fireball in there. And now our brand abilities attaching to the enemy, and they will cast a Fireball. That's awesome. That's really cool. It really is. And we'll definitely see some builds with that. But it also provides us with the possibility to use it as utility options. And I think that's really cool in general. And there are just more and more of these things coming out, allowing us to get this variety of builds into the game, which also emphasizes a lot on how people enjoy the game. They have more options, more builds they want to try out and play. There's a lot more options to play with. And when it comes to the skill tree translation of that with the cluster jewels, and I agree with you, it's absolutely insane and really good with this cluster jewel approach to it, which you're actually just adding to this already massive tree, which is a lot less complex than it looks like, because you're in a situation where the first glance, I remember, was a clip from Dance Gaming, I believe. He just opens up the skill tree and he's just looking at it. It's like, what the fuck? And I mean, as soon as you start looking at it, there's a lot of traveling around there. You get 10 intelligence there, 10 strength there, 10 dexterity there. Oh, now you have the option to get plus 30 of 2 different attributes. Okay, that's great. But then you have kind of categorizing on this, depending on where you are in the tree, what the actual nodes are doing. You got a lot of melee and life stuff over there. You got a lot of traps, mines, and chaos damage in that corner. So it's a kind of cool idea, and allowing us to have cluster jewels would allow us to nibble on the opposite side of the spectrum of the skill tree by being in one corner, which is heavily focused on one approach of nodes, and then the cluster jewels will allow us to touch upon nodes that are a similar type of archetype nodes that are available on the opposite side of the tree, which would be too expensive to spend traveling nodes to reach. So I think it's a really cool system, and it needed a lot of balancing, but I think they're getting there. So it's going to be fun to see with that in mind. So you mentioned you enjoy summoner builds and spellcaster builds in general. I've suggested ball lightning builds or something like that as well for you earlier. In general, when you look at the available options we've seen and some new abilities coming in as well, have you ever thought about, is there any specific builds or abilities that you really would want to do, but you never really got into?
That's a good question. So I haven't actually played a. I'm assuming I'm not going to see a build guide from you on this, but a bow wielder, simply because I do like bow wielders. I like that kind of range class. I've never done that in PoE. I don't think so, at least. I know once I was playing with my fiance, we were leveling up characters. I was following a guide. She wanted to just do what she wanted to do, and as we were going leveling up, like her archer was destroying stuff. She was like specking it into all damage nodes in the passive tree, and she was destroying everything until we got to like Act 3 when everything started one-shotting her, and she realized she made a terrible, terrible mistake. And then my build guide was finally kicking in, and was yeah, but yeah. So I do like the archer place. Again, anything really ranged. I mean, it could be an archer, could be a mage. Like I don't it doesn't super matter to me whether it's shooting a bow or shooting a fireball, but I just like the idea of keeping away. I like highly mobile builds as well. So, which I mean, in PoE, everything is highly mobile, or it's not a build. I guess it's fair to say.
Except the two-handed weapons coming in 3.11.
So I guess I definitely won't be going for that.
Nice, that makes sense. I actually did upload an ice shot bow build 2 weeks ago.
Oh, no kidding! Awesome. How much did you hate making it?
That's one of the very few times through my 6 years of a content creator did not enjoy what I was doing on the screen, but I did it because it was long story short, we had a goal set up and we reached it, and I was supposed to play one melee build and one bow build, like the two builds that are so far out of my comfort zone you can get. The melee build I've done before though, so that wasn't that bad. But oh sweet Jesus, the bow build. My problem with bow builds in general is that they're very hard to get to the point where now they're too strong. They're well balanced. Now they're too strong, or we have to keep them down because there's so many easy tools available for us to make them skyrocket in efficiency. That's why jewels and whatnot, many bow builds, not all, this is not for all bow builds, but for the most part, they're very jewel heavy and requires very specific gear before they really skyrocket. But once they do, they can do an absurd amount of damage. Before cluster jewels and whatnot, I do believe there was a barrage bow building standard that it was considered to do the most damage in the entire game, for example, and so you can reach some absurd numbers with it. But I just don't like the idea that you can't really get it to a comfortable state without already investing a lot of currency to it. That's why I've never really liked bow builds. Again, I'm not very experienced with it. Even after 25,000 hours, I'm still learning, especially if you're talking about bow stuffs. I know the generic stuffs about it, but I'm not experienced with it enough to know the tips and tricks of how to tackle those specific issues in the progression, and the early progression before you can invest that much currency to it, if you will.
I feel like every league I find at low level this unique quiver. I forget what it's called, but I feel like it's always the same one. Every league I find this unique quiver, and I'm like, oh, this is garbage. No one uses bow builds, and it's low level anyway. I mean, I guess most uniques are garbage technically, but
it might be like Black Glebe or Here is Sire or Asphyxia or something like that, maybe? Is it like a black one? Like physical damage converted to fire?
Let me see. Unique quivers PoE. Let me see. I can. Oh no, Asphyxia's Wrath. That's the one. Asphyxia's Wrath. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
But there's actually twinked leveling characters can do very, very well with bow builds. Like you can pretty much run through the content. Obviously, we have things like Hollow Palm now, so it might not be that good anymore, but it has been considered a very, very good twinked leveling approach. But again, I mean, if you don't like playing it, like myself, then I'd rather do a mage build, so to say, and I'd rather get myself like the scepters that gives flat damage to your spells, and suddenly you have something you can use a little 50 plus before you even consider switching them out. And it just makes it more comfortable in general, but it also has a lot to do with what kind of builds you play that makes it enjoyable. But then again, there's different archetypes within bow builds as well. Anything from Null's Inclination summon a build, Mirror Blink Arrow summon a build, which are not that good. But you also have the pseudo summon builds, like you can use a Caustic Arrow, for example, or Toxic Rain, which is more focused like on dot approach rather than on-hit bow builds, which is what you'd consider a bow build to use. And then obviously you have the other aspect of making mage build that is using a bow, because you can access plus level of gems easier on bows. Like Eating Contagion is very popular to be actually wielding a bow, even though it's actually a chaos mage build. So I mean, it all boils down to what you enjoy playing, ultimately, I guess. Which is good, right? Variety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. So this has been a pleasure. I got to go run some errands now, but thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah,
always great to chat.
Likewise. I think we said about an hour. We're almost closing in on 2, so sorry for keeping you.
No worries at all, man. I had a great time. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me.
All right.
And well, I guess I'll probably chat with you quickly, probably through Discord text, just to figure out after the patch notes hit. I need to hear what your final thoughts there.
Absolutely.
Man, it's gonna be in what, 4 or 5 hours?
I have no idea.
Depending on the time, I might even be able to see your reaction on stream if you're gonna be on stream.
I'm gonna stream all the way to the patch notes and then some. So yeah. I don't know. It can be anything from 4 hours to 8-10 hours from now. So we have no idea. Hopefully I'm awake. All right. Well, it's a pleasure having you, Wrecker, as always. We'll stay in touch in Discord, and good luck in Harvest League.
Thanks so much. You too.
Cheers. Bye-bye.